Hey G7, this is the global gender gap. Did you know that it will take us another 135 years to bridge it? That the pandemic has set us back by a generation in closing this gap? That marginalized women and girls in the global south are most vulnerable to the impacts of the climate crisis, even though they have contributed the least to the problem? We need to turn this phase of crisis into a phase of change. This phase of change needs all of our faces, all of our voices, and we are ready to face it. So, are you ready? We are the W7, a joint force of representatives of gender equality organizations and advocacy groups. Our goal is to bring gender justice into focus within the G7. Our demands will be poured into a final declaration, and we hand it over to the presidency. So join us and become a face of change. For more than 45 years, the G7 has represented an informal forum of the formerly most powerful economic nations of the global north. The G7 is not just this one summit, it is a long process with an influential outcome, the G7 communiqué. So let's face it, women in all their diversity need to be wherever decisions are being made. Represented. Together, we create a gender equitable way out of the crisis. W7, time to face the change, time to bridge the gap and get over it.
Hello and welcome to the Women's 7 Summit 2022. My name is Caroline Auser and I'm the W7 project coordinator. I'm very pleased, dear audience, to guide you through a very exciting program today. We are proud that during the Germany's G7 presidency, the National Council of German Women's Organizations, in German Deutscher Frauenrat, is hosting the International Civil Society Dialogue on Gender Equality to the G7, the Women 7. Now I'd like to thank our supporters. This summit would not be possible without the support of the Federal Ministry of Family Affairs, Senior Citizens, Women and Youth. Furthermore, we got support from the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development that made participation from the Global South possible. Thank you. During the next 2 days, great activists and experts will participate at this event. We will talk about current challenges and W7 key demands. Of course, we look forward to the handover of the W7 communiqué to G7 President and Chancellor Olaf Scholz tomorrow. And already today, we start our conversation with the Federal Minister for Women, Lisa Paus. Before we get into the content, here are a few organizational details and housekeeping information. So you can find the W7 communiqué and implementation plan, as well as speaker information on the W7 webpage and the streaming of the landing page. The W7 summit is being translated from English to German and the other way around. Just click on the button on the webpage to change the language. There's also a possibility to ask questions. There is a Q&A tool on the right side, and the questions will be moderated, and those visible can also be ranked higher. So make sure to read them and to vote them. And please be assured that we take every question seriously, but we are expecting a very tight schedule, so we cannot guarantee that all questions will be answered. And before I say more about today's event, we want to know more about you, dear audience. There is an interactive button on the side of the stream, and we would like to know from which city or town are you dialing in. So just click there and put in your answer, and no worries, you have some time for this. I will present the results later on before the first panel. And now, quickly, I would like to give you a brief preview of the program today. After the opening of the conference by the president of the Deutsche Frauenrat, Dr. Beate von Mickel, we are looking forward to the keynote by Federal Minister for Women, Lisa Paus. This will be followed by the first panel. This is about gender-just COVID recovery and a transformative economy. After a short break, the second panel follows. That's about gender-sensitive responses to the climate crisis. And at both panels, we're very thrilled to to have very great guests, wonderful guests from politics, but also civil society. So that's also our main concern. We want the conversation about gender equality in the G7 to get started, and not only to get started with it, but to firmly embed gender equity in the G7. Because it's time to deliver. And this is also our hashtag for today and for the whole year, actually. And for today, it's another one, also W7 Summit 2022. Make sure to tag it. And please engage with us also on social media at Women7Official. And now I'm very glad to hand over to the President of the National Council of German Women's Organizations, Dr. Beate von Mickel. Please, the floor is yours.
Caroline. Dear Minister Paus, dear Women7 representatives, dear colleagues, allies and friends, distinguished audience, I am honored to hereby inaugurate the Women7 Summit under the German G7 presidency. My name is Beate von Mickel and I am the president of Deutscher Frauenrat, the National Council of German Women's Organizations, and I am very pleased to welcome you today in this virtual setting. My organization is representing more than 60 national women's associations and organizations and is thus the biggest women's lobby in Germany. We are proud that during Germany G7 presidency, Deutscher Frauenrat is hosting the International Civil Society Dialogue on Gender Equality to the G7, the Women7. We want to thank the Federal Ministry for Family Affairs, Senior Citizens and Women and Youth for the support of our W7 dialogue. Through a multi-stage consultation process, Women7 Germany brought together an international network of feminist and civil society advocates. Over several months, more than 60 Women7 advisors from 24 countries developed powerful demands on gender equality to the G7. In this journey, putting voices from the Global South front and center has been crucial to us. 1/3 of the Women7 advisors comes from the Global South, and it was crystal clear to us that G7 discussions will not only impact the G7, but also beyond. So including the ones by the G7, including the ones affected by the G7 is crucial. Nothing about us, nothing without us. The G7 is an important value-based platform. The G7 also gathers powerful countries from the global north and remains a forum exclusive in character. This forum must open its doors to voices from the global south. We must sharpen our focus and address the needs of Black, indigenous and people of color, LGBTIQ communities and other groups that face marginalization and systemic discrimination. Especially in times like these, with Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine, the climate crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic, G7 leaders need to acknowledge and address the violent effects these overlapping crises have on women, girls and marginalized communities all over the world. We are deeply concerned about the war in Ukraine and other ongoing conflicts with their devastating humanitarian and human rights impact, as well as increasing militarization and a rekindling of the international arms race. We are concerned about the impacts of the climate crisis on livelihood, health, safety and security of women and girls around the world. Up to 80% of the people fleeing due to climate-related disasters are women. We are concerned about how chronic underfunding of public social infrastructure is forcing women to fill the gaps with unpaid or underpaid care work, as we have seen during the COVID-19 pandemic. During the pandemic, in nearly every country, a higher percentage of women lost their job compared to men. We are concerned about the unequal distribution of vaccines, which remains a driver of global inequality, alongside insufficient access to sexual and reproductive health and rights. And we are also concerned about the ongoing crisis of gender-based violence that has intensified over the past 2 years. G7 leaders must address and find answers to these crises and their gendered impacts. We need to stand together and find meaningful and inclusive ways out of the crisis. At the same time, it is important to recognize women and girls in all their diversity are driving agents of change and must have a seat on the table. It is truly time to deliver for a gender-just future, as the slogan of this year's Women's 7 Summit goes. In our communiqué, the Women's 7 calls on G7 leaders to ensure meaningful participation and representation of women and girls at all levels of decision-making, to apply gender equality as a cross-cutting principle and to use instruments such as gender impact assessments to address structural discrimination, to implement gender-responsive budgeting globally and domestically to make the gendered impacts of budgets visible, including on unpaid care work, to invest in sex and gender-responsive intersectional data generation. And finally, we need an accountability mechanism that tracks and reports about the progress towards gender equality in the G7. We expect the G7 to build their commitments on these principles for a sustainable and a gender-just present and future. But of course, this is not all there is. We are very proud to present during this Women's 7 Summit the outcomes of our intense work and to discuss our recommendations and ideas on how to truly implement them with several stakeholders representing politics, academia. Our vision is a G7 with transformative power, an inclusive, not exclusive forum which is open to the voices from the global south, addressing our responsibility in terms of colonial legacies, a platform that stands up for a more equal and gender-just world, bringing women and girls and gender-diverse people into decision-making spaces. A forum that ensures gender equity is part and parcel of all G7 discussions and decisions. And I'm deeply convinced, only together we can create more inclusive, resilient, and gender-just societies for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Beate. Thank you. Thank you. And now we very much welcome Federal Minister for Women, Lisa Paus. Before starting her keynote, we will take the opportunity to take a picture with our president. Please, if you come here.
Photos are taken. Dear women from the G7, I'm really happy to be here, and I wish you all the best for your summit here in my hometown, Berlin. I am sure you will be very productive and get great results that you can present for the G7 presidents. And now I turn into German. Sehr geehrte Frau Dr. von Mickel, sehr geehrte Vertreterinnen von Women's 7, als Bundesfrauenministerin, welche Kamera? Die Kamera. Ah, die Kamera ist an. Als Bundesfrauenministerin begrüße ich auch Sie sehr herzlich zum W7 Summit 2022. A warm welcome to everyone. Ich freue mich außerordentlich, diesen W7-Gipfel zu eröffnen. Für mich ist das heute ein ganz besonderer Termin. Vielleicht haben Sie es mitbekommen, ich bin nun seit genau 4 Wochen Frauenministerin, seit meiner Jugend und in meinem ganzen politischen Leben Feministin. Und ich empfinde es aufrichtig als Ehre, heute in Ihrem Kreis dabei zu sein. Denn wir wissen, nicht nur beim Geld ist Gleichberechtigung noch lange nicht erreicht. Für Gleichberechtigung in allen Bereichen setzen sich der Deutsche Frauenrat und Women 7 ein. Und darum danke ich dem Deutschen Frauenrat für die Einladung zu dieser Veranstaltung. Wie alle politischen Ereignisse in diesem Jahr steht auch dieser Gipfel unter dem Eindruck des Krieges in der Ukraine. Und es ist wichtig, dass Sie heute auch über geschlechterspezifische Gewalt sprechen. Denn einmal mehr sind Frauen überproportional von Flucht und Gewalt betroffen. Und einmal mehr nutzen autokratische Regime Krisenzeiten wie die Pandemie oder die allgemeine Verunsicherung für ein gesellschaftliches Rollback, indem sie überkommene Rollenbilder wiederbeleben. Weit entfernt von Gleichstellung und Gleichberechtigung von Männern und Frauen. Und es ist richtig, auch über neue Spielräume feministischer Politik zu sprechen. Für mich ist klar, unser Verständnis von progressiver Politik, von Feminismus und sozialer Gerechtigkeit, das ist der erklärte Gegenentwurf zu autoritären und zu militaristischen Regimen. Und darum bin ich sehr froh, dass wir als deutsche G7-Präsidentschaft in den Women 7 einen starken Partner im Kampf für mehr Geschlechtergerechtigkeit an unserer Seite wissen. Liebe Mitstreiterinnen, 2022 ist für die Women 7, aber auch für mein Ministerium ein Jahr der Premieren auf G7-Ebene. Erstmals haben wir im Bundesfrauenministerium gemeinsam mit dem Bundesentwicklungsministerium die Leitung der noch jungen Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment Working Group übernommen. Und erstmals lädt die deutsche Zivilgesellschaft im Rahmen der deutschen G7-Präsidentschaft zu dem Austausch innerhalb der Women 7 ein. Women 7 steht für den wichtigen Austausch mit der feministischen Zivilgesellschaft. Wir brauchen Ihre Perspektiven und Ihren Beitrag, um erfolgreich Gleichstellungspolitik zu machen. Und dafür danke ich dem Deutschen Frauenrat, dass er diesen Austausch in diesem Jahr organisiert. Ich danke aber auch ganz besonders den weltweiten 64 Beraterinnen, die mit ihrer Perspektive zu dem Ziel der Gleichstellung beitragen. Denn echte Gleichstellung, wir wissen es, ist leider noch in keinem einzigen Land der Welt erreicht. Und völlig zu Recht steht dieses Women 7 Treffen unter der Überschrift Time to Deliver. Sie hatten bereits intensiv darauf hingewiesen und es auch noch mal entwickelt in dieser Zeit. Also Zeit zu liefern. Denn nach vielen Fortschritten in den vergangenen Jahrzehnten hat die Corona-Pandemie in nur 2 Jahren atemberaubend uns zurückgeworfen und gleichzeitig gravierende Missstände, die man zwischendurch schon so ein bisschen nicht mehr gesehen hat, einfach noch mal aufgedeckt. Frauen leisten nach wie vor einen Großteil der bezahlten und auch der unbezahlten Sorgearbeit. Zugleich werden sie meist schlechter bezahlt, arbeiten in Teilzeit oder arbeiten in Jobs ohne weitere Aufstiegschancen und soziale Absicherung. Und auch in Führungspositionen sind Frauen nach wie vor unterrepräsentiert. Das wollen wir abstellen. Diese Ungleichheit ist nun wirklich endgültig aus der Zeit gefallen. Im Kreis der G7 und weltweit. Wir alle wissen, um alle Formen der Diskriminierung von Frauen und Mädchen aus der Welt zu schaffen, wie es die Staatengemeinschaft mit der UN-Agenda 2030 beschlossen hat, müssen diese 50% dieser Menschheit gleichberechtigt an allen Entscheidungen beteiligt werden. Ich möchte in einer Welt leben, in der Frauen gleichberechtigt mitbestimmen, wenn es um die Verteilung von Chancen, von Land, von Ressourcen und von Geld geht. Und um die Verteilung von Macht. Und deshalb ist es wichtig, dass Frauen in den relevanten Entscheidungsgremien Gesicht und Stimme bekommen. Umso mehr freue ich mich deshalb, dass die Women 7 ihre diesjährigen Empfehlungen morgen an Bundeskanzler Olaf Scholz persönlich übergeben werden. Mit unseren G7-Partnern werden wir uns dafür einsetzen, Gleichstellung auch international weiter voranzubringen. International können wir ohnehin viel voneinander lernen und miteinander erreichen. So ist für mich zum Beispiel auch Frankreich ein gutes Vorbild. Seine zuverlässige Kinderbetreuung hilft bei der Vereinbarkeit von Familie und Beruf und fördert damit die ökonomische Gleichstellung. Vor diesem Hintergrund begrüßen wir es sehr, dass mit dem G7 Gender Equality Advisory Council auch dieses Jahr ein Gremium mit hoher Fachexpertise einen kritischen Blick auf die Situation der Gleichstellung in den G7-Staaten und weltweit werfen wird. Und ich danke schon jetzt Frau Professor Almdinger sowie den weiteren Mitgliedern des GEAC für die fachliche Begleitung der deutschen G7-Ratspräsidentschaft. Liebe Vertreterinnen von Women's 7, im Rahmen der deutschen G7-Präsidentschaft hat sich das Bundesfrauenministerium viel vorgenommen. Wir werden dafür sorgen, dass Gleichstellungspolitik in 4 Wochen beim G7-Gipfel in Elmau auch einen angemessenen Platz auf der Tagesordnung findet. In der Abschlusserklärung des Elmau-Gipfels 2015, da war es bei dem reinen Bekenntnis geblieben, die Arbeit zur Stärkung der Gleichstellung fortzusetzen. Dieses Jahr muss in dem Dokument mehr stehen. Es muss ausbuchstabiert werden, wie wir die G7-Gleichstellung tatsächlich erreichen wollen. Außerdem setzen wir uns dafür ein, dass die G7 ihre Fortschritte im Bereich Gleichstellung dann auch regelmäßig überprüfen. Hierfür möchten wir gerne im Kreis der G7 einen neuen Monitoring-Mechanismus beschließen. Dieser sollte anhand der Indikatoren Bildung, Wirtschaft, Führung und Gesundheit und Entwicklungszusammenarbeit die Fortschritte bei der Gleichstellung messen. Im Oktober möchte ich zu einem Treffen der G7-Gleichstellungsministerinnen und Minister nach Berlin einladen. Dann geht es um Frauen in Führungspositionen, um Sorgearbeit, um Lohntransparenz und um gleiche Bezahlung für gleiche Arbeit. Und auch bei dieser Veranstaltung werden wir selbstverständlich Women's 7 und den GEAC einbinden. Liebe Mitstreiterinnen und Mitstreiter, ich bin Feministin aus Überzeugung und aus Leidenschaft. Lassen Sie uns gemeinsam stärker und lauter für echte Gleichstellung kämpfen, sonst bekommen wir sie nicht, aber gemeinsam schaffen wir das.
Thank you, Minister Paus. We are so grateful having you here today, and thank you for your support for W7. Thank you again. Thank you. So, we move on in our program, where there's not so much time left, but I don't want to withhold from you the results of our interactive survey. So I want to know, what did I want to know? I wanted to know, where are you based? From where are you dialing in? Which city or town? So maybe can we see the results now, dear colleagues over there? And so let's see. From where are you dialing in today? And I can tell you, we have W7 advisors really from all over the world here with us today. They're sitting here with me in the studio. Some traveled really almost all some came from Japan, from Iraq, from South Africa, from all over the world. We're really proud to have you all. And what is the results? Didn't you not participate in the question, so maybe we get back to the interactive survey later on. And I cannot see the results, dear colleagues, in the technical division. So then I propose to move on to the first panel. No? Should we wait? Can I have we wait a little bit longer? Okay, good. They tell me to have a little bit patience, so be with me. And it was exciting, the speech of the minister, I thought, and we are very honored to have her today. And you be with us tomorrow also, where we have the handover to the Chancellor and G7 President, Olaf Scholz. So now I see something moving here in our indication on the icebreaker question. And yes, maybe there are some little technical issues there. Can I get some other sign? if we will get the answer soon or if we wait a little bit more. Maybe we should still participate in the question from where you're dialing in. Yeah, they tell me it takes a little bit longer. So maybe I already introduce a little bit of the panel, what we are supposed to hear now. So soon there will be the first panel, and it will be about gender-just COVID recovery and transformative economy. And this is a very important issue since we, from the W7, we had 2 working groups on this issue, preparing the communiqué and the implementation plan. So this panel will be moderated by Juliane Rosin. She's the head of the Division of the International Affairs at the National Council of German Women's Organizations. And she's also leading the project W7 in 2022. So let's wait a little bit longer if we get the answer on the icebreaker. And then we will have another surprise for you, dear audience, because there will be a video coming up before the first panel. And there you will see our W7 advisors telling you what are our key demands on this issue, on COVID, gender equal, on gender-just COVID recovery. Sorry, the other way around. So some more information on where you're dialing in. Maybe you did not participate enough. Maybe we have to I'm sorry. Okay, so we will see the video first, and then maybe afterwards we come back to the results. So enjoy the video announcing the first panel. Go.
Hey, G7.
Progress in gender equality is impossible without women's economic empowerment.
According to the World Economic Forum, it will take 268 years to close the gender gap in economic participation, and this is simply not acceptable.
As you know, the pandemic has had a disproportionate impact on women and girls around the world, especially those who are most marginalised. Women's unpaid and underpaid work has had to fill in the gaps as public services are stretched to their limits, while more women lost their jobs than men, and their return to paid work has been slower.
In the face of global crises, G7 must ensure that women and girls progress in the world of work, are equipped with full economic rights and opportunities.
We, as W7 advisor, thus call to the G7 to adopt transformative economic policies that go behind crisis management to address structural economic barriers to gender equality.
To promote decent work for women both at home and globally, including migrant workers and those working in the informal sector.
G7 countries should provide tailored support for women entrepreneurs and ensure their equal access to finance, to markets, and to procurement opportunities.
We, the W7 advisor, choose call on the G7 to ensure to provide quality education, mentoring, and training systems at all levels for women and girls in all their diversity.
We at the W7 say it's time to strengthen women's leadership in COVID responses. It's time for decisive action to implement feminist economic recovery packages that promote decent work for women in all their diversity, that recognise the value of unpaid care across policymaking, and that invest an additional 2% of a country's GDP in gender transformative health and care services.
Are you ready? It's time to deliver.
Time to deliver.
It is time to deliver.
Some applause for our W7 advisors here, please. Because it sounds so simple, just 2.5 minutes, but actually it's been months of intense work. So really grateful that you spent your energy and your work on this, and having very concrete recommendations will definitely help to convince the G7. and I'm really happy and delighted to have the honor, yes, my name is Juliane Rosin, to facilitate this very first panel. And even though we're waiting for some very important person, I think we just start to set the scene and use this time just the way we want to use it, right? So I want to use the time to speak with you about the gendered consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I assume most of you already heard that, well, women and girls and marginalized people were disadvantagedly or higher affected by the consequences of the pandemic. Just some numbers. So women lost their jobs about twice as much compared to men globally, twice as much. To give you even more concrete understanding what this means, this came together in a total of about $800 billion missing. So women and girls really lost money during the pandemic. And actually, even prior to the pandemic, there was a gender divide on the labor market participation. So what we see is that the pandemic, again, multiplied already existing discriminations and structural inequalities, not just based on gender, but also based on religion, race, ethnicity, displacement status. So I'm very happy to be here, not alone on this panel, but to have very qualified panelists. And I want to introduce them very quickly, at least the ones already here. And then later, of course, we'll include the one who is still missing. So sitting next to me, I have Musna Delt. She is now based in Canada, but you're original from Syria. So you traveled all the way from Canada just to attend our summit. So I'm very thankful for that. You're an W7 advisor. So it was also your work we just listened to. Thank you so much for that. You're a policy analyst and a researcher and an advocate for the diaspora of women's refugees' political participation. And you are a co-founder of the Syrian Women's Political Movement. And also you founded Women Refugees Not Captives, aiming to end forced and child marriages of Syrian women refugees and girls. And I really want to talk about how the pandemic hit women on the ground and women's networks and what's needed to support them, not just for their own sake, but for all our sake. So thank you so much for coming and being here. So, and sitting next to Musna, we have from Ukraine, now based in Berlin, Daria Mustafina. You're an entrepreneur and an activist, I learned. And you're here to speak about your perspectives as a founder and director of the Institute for Partnership and Sustainable Development. And also you're the coordinator of the Academy for Women Entrepreneurs. That is a network of women entrepreneurs who are now using their capacities to, well, use their enterprises for humanitarian aid to support the situation on the ground. But this is not where you started. You actually been a youth activist right from the start, right? So I learned you are one of the young world ambassadors for Ukraine. So we're very happy to have you here, Daria, and go into everything later. But as you can see on the screen, we don't only have wonderful women here in Berlin, we also have someone tuned in from New York. Speaking for France, it's Delphine O. She's ambassador at large. And I think it's very interesting to know that she is the youngest ambassador in the history of France. And even more important for us, she is the Secretary General for United Nations Generation Equality process that took place yesterday. Last year. But obviously, there will be some follow-ups in the future, and we will discuss this later. But I think something really should know right now, this process was co-organized not just by France, but also with Mexico, and facilitated and organized by the UN Women. And yes, we are very looking forward to have you. And I think we just jump into it directly. And as I said later, and we include the missing one. So, Musna, I'd like to start with you. So I already explained that you're intensely engaged when it comes to, women's organizations, working with the people on the ground, and just give us some quick understanding. How did the pandemic hit you, the work, and the women you work with? So we have better understanding of concrete examples.
Yeah,
I think it's on.
It's on?
Yes.
Okay. as a intern worker coming in from Syria, so it's like working in this field. It's not easy because you have bomb from the sky and also a pandemic on the ground. So with the country that has 6 million of displaced people, half of them women and children, and they are in limbo for years. It's been a decade for Syria, and the situation of COVID puts women's life under risk, under concrete risk, because what I noticed from the ground, that at the beginning, the funding cuts that happened at the beginning of the COVID has affected services for women, including shelters, health services, and also education and empowerment programs for women. So this is at the beginning. So women ended up without having access for basic services because the whole world, it's just busy to respond to the pandemic. So this is why the funding it's really affected the response of the local civil society and local NGOs on the ground, and also the situation of women. And because of the lockdown, and so many of women have been victims of gender-based violence from. They've been locked in their tents or in their camps, and sometimes in their where they are based, and faced a violence from their partners or their family members. So and without having any difficulties to reach out service providers and also protection providers to help them to find a way to get out of this situation. Further, the shift to online spaces also, you can imagine even in developed countries there's a need for devices and internet and connection. So imagine for displaced women, there is not enough, and sometimes there is no equipment and also infrastructure for displaced women to reach online spaces. And if so still they are not protected because they don't have also tools to protect themselves in virtual space, and also to navigate how to use these tools to reach protection, education, and also empowerment programs. So I think COVID puts women in the global south and in the global north in a very difficult situation that needs to all of us to collaborate to tackle these problems and to address these dilemmas from a collaborative perspective, and to help women to get out of this situation.
Thank you so much. Yes, I understand. So the cutting of funding, so having nothing to support you and your work, and then everything turning into the digital space, but with no access to this in the first place, how to organize.
Exactly.
And I assume especially the second one, Daria, was very important for you and your work. Once the pandemic hit us, you already had this network of women entrepreneurs engaging. And then what did you do? How did it look like in your situation?
Yeah, basically it's right. Thank you very much for raising these important topics. I'm Ukrainian and it's my superpower. And I'm honored to be director of Institute of Partnership and Sustainable Development and to implement the Academy for Women Entrepreneurs. And to be directly on the frames of lockdown and pandemic, we organized online academy for thousands of women entrepreneurs in Ukraine. And they were able basically to organize digital transformation of their businesses, to change supply chains, to start to export their products or to find new clients. And basically now this powerful network of women entrepreneurs become a network of people who saving lives, who help to evacuate people, who help to provide food and necessities to civilians in different cities of Ukraine. Because directly today it's 3 months after the war come in our sovereign country, and on the 24th of February it was a full invasion of Russian Federation to our sovereign country, and basically now millions of people lost their jobs, houses and livelihood. 6.1 millions of refugees was needed to flee from Ukraine, and basically 99% of them are women and children. 6 millions of people are internally displaced, and 12 more millions are affected directly by the intervention. And of course we need to understand that this is during these 3 months, more than 500 schools were destroyed and kindergartens, around 800, hundreds of hospitals, and it's around 32 millions of square meters of housing. It's around half of the millions of families lost their homes. So we understand that it's one of the biggest refugee and basically economic crisis after the Second World War, which are rising and not stopped yet. That's why of course the experience which we received during the pandemic and operating with our network of activists and entrepreneurs now become very important to save people's lives, because our amazing women entrepreneurs, for example, instead of producing swimming suits or underwear and be represented on the Paris exhibitions, they produce now uniform or bulletproof jackets and give it for free for our defenders, or give for free food, bread, or some necessities to civilians, helping people to survive. And especially it's very important if we are talking about occupied territories, because right now part of the network are working on the frames of occupation on Donbas, on Kherson region, on Kharkiv region. It's farmers who are the only one who produce and basically to provide some food for local people, and it's very important to support them, of course, and basically to provide them some funds and also knowledges how to relocate, how to restart their businesses, and basically how to move forward. And in this case, the work of Academy of Women, it's very important. And of course, if we understand that Ukrainian economy, it's 99% of Ukrainian economy, it's small and medium enterprises, and only 13% now are working. So it's a big task for us as organization, NGO, to restart and relocate the small and medium enterprises, to provide them a knowledge and consulting and mentorship, how to back to business, and basically how to combine volunteering and saving people's lives, providing some products and services to civilians, and also basically to have some cash flow for their businesses, and probably to go to international markets to export their products, and basically to save Ukrainian economy.
Thank you so much. I think what both of you clearly stated is that we don't have just one crisis, and we don't have that one type of women. We have intersecting crises that are multiplying themselves, and having your very concrete examples, and you just adding the fact you are already agents of not just change, but you're operating in the system. You're providing help. Women aren't just victims. Yes, your network is intensely important to provide help which is needed on the ground. And I think we have so many stakeholders tuned in both representing governments, but also private sector and other people and organizations that can support. I hope you listen very carefully, because there are concrete projects that need support. And speaking about support, dear Ambassador, I'd like to turn to you. So the generation equality process was a victim itself to the COVID-19 pandemic. It actually was planned to take place in 2020, and due to the pandemic, everything had to be postponed just 1 year. And looking at the website, it reads that at the last meeting in Paris, you launched a 5-year action journey to achieve irreversible progress towards gender equality, founded on a series of concrete, ambitious, and transformative actions, including $40 billion in financial commitments. That sounds quite awesome, I have to say. So listening to the real challenges women's groups and women entrepreneurs are facing on the ground, I would like to hear from you. So what's the next step? I mean, having these concrete commitments, how will they really be implemented? And I did some calculations. We just learned we lost in those 2 years of pandemic about $800 billion in income. So $40 billion sounds a lot, but it's actually just 5%. I know you're not responsible for covering it all up, but I think you get my point. So what's coming up next? Sorry, I can't hear her, unfortunately. Just 1 second, I can't hear you, so can someone give me a sign if you can hear the ambassador?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. Oh, so great. So yeah, that sounds like pandemic, so you're still on mute. So very good to hear you.
Thank you very much, Julianne, and thank you to the Women 7 for the invitation. So I'm here to represent both the government of France, but also the generation equality. As you have said, $40 billion to support gender equality and women's rights in the next 5 years. It may sound a lot, but it's definitely not enough. It is, I would say, a good starting point, remembering that it had been, at the time that we held the forum last year in 2021, 26 years since we haven't had a UN World Conference on women's rights and gender equality. So, again, it's a good starting point. The objective of the forum is specifically, and building on my two predecessors, not to trigger a new international convention on women's rights or gender equality, not to have a new resolution, not to have a new declaration by leaders, but precisely to fund specific, concrete, action-oriented projects. And these funding is organized around 6 action coalitions on different topics. One is gender-based violence, another one is economic empowerment, another one yet is the intersection of gender justice and climate justice, and so on. And so we had
sadly we
companies and philanthropies to actually step in and to commit financial commitments, and to commit also through a new legislative framework for the next 5 years.
That sounds like a very good starting point. So I saw that our final guest did arrive, so I used this break to welcome Dirk Meyer on stage. He's the representative for the current G7 presidency and representing the Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. We're very happy to have you. I have to look it up because your title is very long, but very interesting. You will recognize in a second. So you're the Director General for Global Health, Employment, and now Transformation of the Economy. So I think we have the right guy. Digital Technologies, Food, Nutrition, Security. Thank you so much for taking your time and being here. And I just give you a short summary of what we already discussed, because the stories you already listened to were quite intense and very important. So we realized that the pandemic hit women and girls, the marginalized groups, extremely. They lost their job disproportionately more than compared to men. They had a huge loss of income during that time. And we see that especially on the ground, talking about women refugees and women entrepreneurs, huge cuts of funding, even though the capacity of women and women organizations organizing themselves and providing help themselves, coming them, wasn't really used. And what we see is that the recovery funds that were put together in an intense space were were just trying to fix a system we wanted to overcome. So we see that millions and trillions of dollars going into companies producing cars where mostly men are working. And we see that all the money which shall help people, employees, well, if women are less employed in the first place, it will definitely have the advantage of you receiving this money. And then, as I said, the fundings for women's organizations, well, this is a situation. Happy you are here. We know that the G7 development ministers just met last week. We're very happy that we had a chance to speak, and we really congratulate the Minister Schulze on the feminist development policy, which is definitely something new and really revolutionary, since she herself was stressing the fact that now it shall be about transformation and inclusion and intersectionality. This is something we honestly never heard from a German ministry so far, so thank you so much for that. But I'd like to understand, since the whole situation is so complex and all those challenges are, as we said, intersecting, what is your impression? What do you think are the main challenges women, girls and marginalized groups are facing right now? And maybe some first ideas on how you act on this. So if you would take the microphone.
Is it on?
Yes, it is on.
Okay. Sorry, it's a bit a part of my hay fever, and I just was rushing on my bike from the ministry to here. I'm still a bit sweating. Thank you very much for the invitation. Actually, what we realized, and the diagnosis is exactly the same you just made, that we are not just living in time of multiple crises, but also that these crises hit women first and most heavily. And one of the really serious beginners, of course, is the COVID crisis, which is still not over. And especially coming from Ministry for Development, we really realize in all spheres that we have major setbacks in development policy, which progress we made in the last 20 years. So it's a dramatic situation. And actually, we have to mention this first when we come to what we can do next. Because the next crisis, which is ongoing at the moment, the energy crisis and the food security crisis, is actually going again in the center also of women and their lives. So when it then comes to debt crisis, which are also arising now, we're in a situation where we think that development policy has to start to rethink in many aspects. And one of the aspects is what Minister Schulze said, to develop what we call feminist development policy. I wouldn't say that it is a buzzword, but of course it means that we not just have to put the issues of women in the center of all policies, but also to think much more between the silos and do it from this point of view, which for me, coming as a person from the administration, is a real challenge. Because it sounds very easy, but we are all trained to work in our silos, not to look at the right-hand side and on the left-hand side, and to build policies in a comprehensive, holistic way with women in the center of this politics is really difficult. And therefore, we first of all have to develop this policy model on the one hand, and put it into the rebuilding aspects. And secondly, of course, strengthen all the organizations that are already in a multilateral sense on the way. Therefore, for instance, I'm very happy that it succeeded, just to mention one example, the GFF back into the financing situation, which was out, which also shows that we have to have a lot of public discussion about what the development nexus means to rebuild a resilient world, which has women in its center. So that is just one aspect. This has to continue and has to being brought back. And if I name another issue, when it comes to build resilient health systems, of course, there women have to be in the center. It's the workforce in the care jobs. That is one aspect, to bring them into formal jobs, to pay them decently, to put these groups into the possibility to get all the vaccines that are needed, to develop their skills and so on. But also when we build a resilient health structure, to see it as a One Health issue, and also look that all new instruments, for instance, when we talk about this new preparedness fund, also to try to put the aspects of women in front when we think what a resilient structure could be. That's the duty we have. It's very big, but yes, but it's necessary. And maybe one last word. When I started my job, I first went to all the multilateral organizations in Geneva to get to know them. And what I discovered there was that Canada is very much on the way with feminist development policy. But Canada needs a big partner on the side, and therefore we talked together with the minister that this will be also on the way to develop this year, to be a good partner and bring this also in these multilateral discussions. So that's maybe for the starting point.
This is definitely a very good starting point, and just stressing the fact how working together on a global level is very important, not just for you, but for us as well. And before I just jump into the second round of questions, I just wanted to tell you as audience, please remember you can ask questions yourself. I believe it's on the right side on the screen. There you can pose your questions and vote on the questions you already see in the chat. And then in the last round, I will just take my tablet and look at your questions, and then I will give it to my dear panelists. And you can be critical as well as me. I'm going to be critical as well. So I just jump back to you, and then I go the other way around, so you have another chance to speak. We learned women organizations and companies are organizing themselves. What you just described is actually what we're asking for. As you said, put women and girls and their need in the center of economy, in the center of health services, and so on and so forth. But let's be quite concrete. We want money in the hands of women, in the hands of women-led organizations and companies. What exactly is the G7 this year doing? Or maybe if not the G7 agreed on this directly, what is the BMZ, so your ministry, the Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, directly doing for those organizations? Because this is essential recommendations coming from the W7 advisors. We're here. We want to act on ourselves. How will you engage with us?
Yeah, well, at the moment we are in the process where we are going in the next budget round, and it's just a couple of days ago we talked about that with the leading level of the BMZ, and where it is quite clear that not just 2 or 3 projects should put this feminist approach on top of the agenda, but that we have to mark every project we do together with the GIZ and with the KfW in order to rethink it in this way. So what we try to do now is to mark this in the matrix for our budget for the complete BMZ. And that also means that the strong element for the civil organizations should be marked in this respect too, and that the talks between the organizations and the BMZ should have this on top of the agenda. That's the approach, and that's what we have to bring on the road now.
Any chance you convince your G7 colleagues and come up with a joint process on this?
Most of them see it, but the difficult part is to bring it to very strong fixed quota and things like that. So.
Did I hear a yes?
Huh?
Did I hear a yes? No, hear a yes.
It is difficult.
It's difficult.
It is difficult. Yes, absolutely. Yes. I mean, as I said, Canada is part of the G7. Canada is very much on our side. But not all see that marking it also means to bring the amount of money in it.
I know.
You have to see that in the international context, Germany with a BMZ, with an independent BMZ, is also a unique situation. So
this is definitely true. What also very true is that France, even prior to their G7 presidency in 2019, pronounced their feminist diplomacy. So this was a very important step, and I think this directly led to co-hosting the Generation Equality. So, dear Ambassador, maybe you just jump in and support your G7 colleague here on what France may do to support this on the G7 level. But also, I learned that in Generation Equality, there was a subgroup working directly on putting money in the hands of women. So please, enlighten us.
Yes, exactly. And I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate our German colleagues for announcing the feminist foreign policy. As you know, we're only a handful of countries around the world, not just in the G7, to have announced a feminist foreign policy. So historically, Sweden, Canada, and France in 2018, Spain, Mexico, Luxembourg, now Germany, Chile has also announced, Libya, and others may come. So there are two things we did in terms of supporting directly feminist organizations. In 2020, we have launched the Support Fund for Feminist Organizations, which is endowed with 120 million euros over 3 years. And the goal of this fund is specifically to provide funding directly to feminist grassroots organizations set in the Global South. And the governance body is shared between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the French Development Agency, l'Agence Française de Développement, and feminist organizations themselves. So it's the first step. We would hope to extend, of course, this fund and also to expand the funding that is available. But also, as you have said, Julianne, in the context of the Generation Equality Forum, one of our 6 priority areas, one of our 6 action coalitions, is specifically titled Feminist Organizations. And the goal of this action coalition is to promote, expand, enhance funding and support for feminist organizations. And in the context of the forum, the Global Alliance for Feminist Organizations was launched by the members of this coalition, namely Canada, the Netherlands, different foundations such as the Ford Foundation, Open Society Foundations, and feminist grassroots organizations like AWID and other ones. And this global alliance has its goal and its mission is really to again trigger more funding and to make more people come on board to support feminist organizations. Following on the footsteps of the Equality Fund launched by Canada a couple of years ago. So we do definitely think that getting the money in the hands of women and feminist organizations is key. And that was also part of our G7 back in 2019. That was part of the Generation Equality Forum, and that continues with the French Support Fund for Feminist Organizations.
That sounds very good. And since Dirk Meyer just briefly touched the field of healthcare and putting women and girls in the center there as well, what was the approach in the Generation Equality, or maybe just the French approach towards supporting more funding for SRHR, so sexual and reproductive health and rights, or health in general? So maybe you just can jump in on this quickly afterwards, but I would like to listen to you first, and then we'll go back to our activists.
Well, another one of our 6 action coalitions was specifically dedicated to SRHR, sexual and reproductive health and rights. And in that action coalition, France is one of the champions, together with Burkina Faso, Denmark, Argentina, the International Planned Parenthood Federation, and a number of civil society organizations. And in this context, France has announced last year at the forum new funding of 400 million euros for the next 5 years. To support access to family planning, to contraception, to increase advocacy for abortion rights, so the right to safe and medical abortion, to support comprehensive sexual education around the world, together with also UNFPA, obviously, which is the UN agency in charge of sexual and reproductive health and rights. So SRHR was one of the 6 focus of the Generation Equality Forum, and healthcare, of course, at large. We also launched on the sidelines of the forum a global coalition for a gender equal workforce in the healthcare segment. So when we talked about healthcare, of course, it's about the health of women, but it's also the presence, the leadership, and the decision-making position of women in the healthcare workforce. We have seen in the COVID that women are the majority among nurses, among midwives, but they are not the one making decisions. And at the time of the COVID, where so many decisions were in the hands of the healthcare personnel, of doctors, of scientific committees, it's also very important that we increase the percentage of women who are in these decision-making bodies at WHO and in other health organizations around the world.
Thank you so much. And I just have to echo what you just said. This is what our W7 advisors from all over the world just told us. I mean, the moment the pandemic hit us, the moment care and social infrastructure just disappeared, it was on the shoulders of mostly women and girls and other marginalized groups to just fill in the gaps. So taking this into account and building forward fairer as the title of our panel. So if you have something concrete to add here.
Well, that's actually part of the attempts G7 put on the agenda. We just not only had the meeting of the G7 development ministers, but also a combination of the health and development ministers meeting a couple of days ago, where especially the building of very comprehensive, stable health systems was put on the agenda. Strengthen the WHO as the main organization, and setting up a new fund that will be able to finance, especially in the low and middle income countries, the structures to build a new health architecture that actually will be able to withstand the next crisis coming up, so that this crackdown of the whole system with all these negative impacts on sexual rights, on early pregnancy, and so on, and all these major setbacks that actually hit women are prevented. And this is a momentum, actually, I think. It's a small window because the societies in the North and in the Global South, they all still realize what this pandemic made for their societies and especially for women. But we have to act as soon as possible. Therefore, we were happy that during the Biden summit, the US went in front to put a big sum of money on the table to build this new health architecture. But we have to go now into details. And the next meeting I will have is together with the health ministry actually to act about that. Yep. And but that's really tough policy where the finance ministers also have their opinion, and it's still a long way to go.
It's definitely true. It's a complex situation,
Absolutely.
And it's at the same time preventing the next challenges or crises to come while going through the challenges we are in right now. And here I want to bring in Daria again, because what you missed, certainly since you come a little bit late, but I think you just can explain it very quickly again. Health and care infrastructure is destroyed in your country right now, and it's up to women to fill in the gaps there as well. But also, I know you're a mother of a 2-year-old child. You're living here now in Berlin, and to my belief, there is no access to kindergarten or something like this, helping you doing your important work as an entrepreneur in a network. So couldn't you give us some more concrete examples on how you work here right now and what would really help you to do your work? Just using your chance to address the G7 directly and the UN, and France is sitting here with us.
Basically, first of all, I am a Ukrainian and it's my superpower. Then I am activist, and we are running like each week humanitarian initiatives in different cities in Ukraine. We send it medicines from Germany also and from other countries all over the world to Ukrainian hospitals. Some of them are on occupied areas, so it's impossible for people to reach any medicines there. I am a mother of 2 years kid whom I was just taken during the first explosions in my native city from his own bed, which was staying on the near the window. Just put them to the sofa on the central part of the room, just not to hit him if the window will be broken up because of the explosions. I'm a woman or wife of a soldier right now who was dislocated from territorial defense from western part of Ukraine to the first line on Donbass. And as other, like for now, it's like, I don't know, thousands or thousands of women who received in the morning only like the message which consists from one sign, it's mean plus, which is means that our my husband and the father of 2 years kid is still alive there. So basically, I am also volunteer who fundraised for like the nearest weeks for our friends and husbands, ammunition, equipment, some like very expensive equipment for communication stuff. Only yesterday we sent it 3 buses for evacuation people and like people who are injured in Lugansk Oblast, and like for almost 1 month my husband was in Popasna. It's like awful, like it's hell, which like with bombings all the time by Russian troops. And of course, like what are the challenges and askings? First of all, it's for the whole country, it's a full membership in European Union, because only economic, energy and trade integration to European Union will bring us security and peace. Secondly, of course, it's an opportunity to full reach G7 and European Union markets till 2030. Of course, the most important right now, it's we still are asking to close the sky to bring us the weapons, because our people sacrifice their lives. They're fighting for European values, for democracy, for rule of law. And they are protecting not only our independence and the independence of our country, but basically the humanism and the future of the whole world. And we sacrifice our lives, but we are asking at least to give us weapons and close the sky, because as the example of our soldier friends who was dislocated as territorial defenders to the first line, they were only with automats before the Russian tanks and aviation. And it's like enormous number of people who were killed there and still dying every day. So, we are women entrepreneurs who saving civilians in occupied territories also. We provide food, necessities, services, and so on. We dislocate and relocate our businesses, and among 6 million of refugees who come now to European Union, it's 99% it's women and kids. So basically our big thanks to European Union for help, but also a big asking to provide a decent job and opportunity to decent job to kindergartens and to schools for our Ukrainian kids, because only in this case Ukrainian women will be able to work and to provide the help for themselves, for their families and for their relatives who are still in Ukraine, and for their fighters, for people who are on the first or other lines. And yes, Ukrainians are not victims, we are fighters, and basically now we are protecting the peace and democracy all over the world. So we are asking for help in this. We are asking to continue and maybe to more help us with medicines, with humanitarian aid, of providing some funds and support to local initiatives, because they are working on the ground, and very often they are only the one who can help the local people. Of course, it's very important to highlight what is going on, because as the colleague was mentioned, now it's a big food crisis all over the world. But we need to understand that if in 1932 it was basically a Holodomor organized by the Russians as well, and we were not able to reach this information in Europe, for example, but now we can see online how they steal millions of tons of Ukrainian grains from Kherson region and basically move it to the territory of Russian Federation, and then probably will sell it also to Europe or some other countries. So our askings, not be quiet, react to what you see, what's going on online, because even some Russian soldiers online post the videos and rape even injured or newborns online. It's unbelievable, but it's true. So the world can the opportunity to reach this information and to react. So we ask not to close their eyes, but basically to react and share what is going on. And what is also very important is, of course, we understand this is hybrid war. So this is important also to support digital initiatives of Ukraine, to support organizations who fight in propaganda and in Europe also and in Ukraine, and basically who are fighting for the truth. So thanks for support, but also the most important, of course, it's help us with weapons and to close the skies, and then we will deal with the others by ourselves.
Well, thank you so much for highlighting the special needs you as a mother and your organization are facing. And I just want to stress this again. As you said, you need access to the markets, otherwise you can't operate. And still you need support for the ones still operating on the ground. And you just very specifically need access for your child to kindergarten. Otherwise, there's no chance to work here. And I think it's very important. So there is definitely achieving peace in Ukraine and globally. And we will hear about Syria later on. This is definitely important. But understanding that these women are fighting there and they need support, real support, this is definitely crucial. And you just touched upon the fact that this is a hybrid setting. So the work you're doing is not just taking place on the ground. Here we have a digital setting today here as well. It's taking place virtually as well. And just yesterday we shortly discussed the fact that your work in Syria was disrupted by the government itself. So maybe you just can take us into this and then just add upon what concretely do you need for your work and what do the women do need your work with, so we just can close the first circle.
Yeah, so back in 2011, I've been also victim of cyber attacks from the Syrian regime, and so they hacked my email, my Facebook and Skype and everything, and this is also what we see is with COVID, that COVID has shown us that there is no borders or limitation for crises and for pandemics, and we need like to have like a real partnership between the global South and the global North, and also to strengthen the local and the grassroots organization, and especially women on the ground, because they have the trust from local communities and also the access to the most like difficult to reach like villages and areas, and this is also what COVID has shown us. Is like we reach them to convince people about like the threat of COVID, and also to get like also vaccine, but also at the same time when there is like a monopoly on vaccines, it's like to have access to vaccines. So if people in global South, in Syria, and like in neighboring countries, refugees, including Yemen and other conflict countries, they don't have like vaccines, so we will not end up with the situation of the pandemic. Now we have like a monkeypox, like a new pandemic. So this is like how we need to see like these problems and these crises. It's like as like we need to tackle these problems together, and like meaningful participation of women and also grassroots organization is a key, is a tool, but it's not the goal. Like, because the goal is like to have equality. And I want to also to build on what Daria said. It's and like to build on that the crisis have no borders, because like impunity in Syria with the Russia intervention, military intervention in Syria, led to the invasion in Ukraine. So if we had accountability at the time, so we will not be in this situation right now. So this is how these crises is like have links and like correlations, and like how we need to really, when there's like a crisis, to put and to use like a local grassroots and local leaders to tackle these problems, and not see it as isolated. This is in Syria, this is in Yemen, this is in Ukraine. No, this is like the impact. It's like on all the world. Like now we are in a food insecurity situation because like Ukraine under the invasion, and like also the like a Russian invasion, and also like Syria when there's like a displacement from Syria to neighboring countries, because like there is no security, there's like a bombs and from the sky, and the pandemic on the ground. So we need to see like a conflicts, pandemics, and in a different way to strengthen preparedness, and also to use grassroots organization as a real partners, not as a ad hoc intervention or like ad hoc. And finally, to have a budget. So there is no change without budget. There is no policy and structural change without having real budget and good funding for like to respond to these crises.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think both of your examples showed very clearly that it's a very important step to start with announcing a feminist development policy or a feminist foreign diplomacy. So this is very important to understand that we really have to transform the way we look at the situation, and we really have to include the ones who we actually wanted to reach. It's nothing we do for them, it's something we do with them to really change the whole situation. So I assume you have something you want to react to those. And I just want to turn towards the audience just quickly. I don't have any questions yet, so I'm not quite sure there's just yet another technical problem of today, or whether you are just so intensely listening that you don't have the time to write something down. So please get engaged with us, and if you have any questions, just send us them to us, but no worries, I have tons of questions myself, so giving the floor to Dirk Marje just once again.
Yes, I mean, it's almost impossible to add something to your not just touching, but also very impressive speech about the real situation at the moment. I mean, coming from a generation who never experienced war and only heard about war when my grandpa and my granddad told, it is shocking, and it shows what is going on at the moment in the middle of Europe. what we do as the BMZ is before the war, even before the war, the development policy was very much engaged in combination between Germany and Ukraine. This is going to continue. And with all the international organizations and partners, we are actually thinking about building funds for rebuilding. So we're looking at the time beyond. But still, the war is on, and that's the fact where we can read every day what the support is. I think what you said is very right. It's also a war about narratives. In my division, I also deal with the food security. We built this Global Alliance for Food Security, where actually the idea was also to fight this Russian narrative that the sanctions actually caused the food crisis, but it's the war that caused the crisis, and you just mentioned that too. Let me add one aspect to you, especially for countries where you have fragile or even destroyed governmental structures or autocratic structures. It's very complicated to develop development policies. And therefore, we concentrate then on the support of civil society organizations. And you just showed how important that is to strengthen the people on the ground to act beyond the very often very complicated governments. And therefore, a development ministry has to act in both directions. With a normal state, you can do it by normal consultations with the governments, but here you are actually forced to go into much more complicated situations and support the civil organizations, which we do. Yes, that's maybe the first reactions.
So, Ambassador, you're in this interesting position to be both a G7 member and speaking for a forum, a process which is located at the UN level. So do we have any more tips for the German colleague who is now having the presidency, since France really used it so uniquely to, as I said, first declaring the feminist foreign diplomacy, then hosting the G7, having engaging with the W7 there as well, and still greetings to my friends from the W7 in France. It was an intense time. And then followed up by the Generation Equality. So any more hints on how to support this, and maybe some ideas for joint approaches for the future, since you're both here?
Well, I don't know if I'm in a position to give advice to the German colleagues. I know they've been dealing with the subject of gender equality very seriously, and maybe a historical note that, as you might know, gender equality and women's rights has not always been a focus of the previous G7, going back a long time ago. It was I think one of the landmark moments was the first G7, the G7 in 2018, in Canada, where the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has established the Gender Equality Advisory Council, also called the GIAC, for those who are interested, which is an advisory body of 20 to 30 expert and renowned personalities for their work on gender equality. Some of them are politicians, some of them are in diplomacy, some of them are economists, some in the media, and this very diverse crowd, which role is to advise the G7 leaders and to provide them with recommendations. And so France had taken up this GIAC in 2019 when we had the presidency. And during the G7 French presidency, we had announced a number of initiatives, but among others, the Biarritz Partnership also. And then it was, there was sort of a gap here when there was a US presidency of the G7, but then the GIAC was reactivated for the British presidency last year. It has also provided important recommendations to the G7 in the UK last year. And I know that the GIAC has also been, will be reactivated delegated by the G7 presidency. So it's very important to have this independent, high-level body providing advice and concrete recommendations for the G7 leaders to base their decision. And of course, it's a very specific time. We have talked a lot about COVID and the impact of COVID on women. I would like to say, and even speaking as a government's representative, it is still an uphill battle working from within the government to make sure that gender equality and women's rights are mainstreamed. And so there will be a G7 equality ministers meeting, but ideally the G7 finance ministers meeting will also tackle gender equality. Ideally, the G7 environment ministers meeting would also tackle gender equality, and so on and so on. Ideally, it would not remain siloed within the purview of gender equality ministers, which are very important. Ideally, all of the different ministers meeting, and of course the leaders meeting in June, would really tackle gender equality as not only a central problem, but also a central solution to building back, the world of tomorrow.
Thank you so much. The first question jumped in and then I destroyed it. So if someone of the technical team could help me with this, sorry so much. Even after 2 years of pandemic, I'm still not able to use a tablet easily, but there they come. And still, I want to use the opportunity because what I saw that most questions are obviously for the representative of the G7. I'm sorry, but still I want to give a chance to the other activists to not just as a final statement, but after listening to everything they just explained, what do you feel is still the most important, really, from your perspective as working on the ground with women organizations? I think you stress intensely the fact that it's so important to have funding for your work, access, and the way to operate on digital level. As we said, you need devices for this and access to this, and you need skills, you need a network of people. But is there anything else you want to add? So maybe Daria, I ask you first, and then Musna, you react, and then I get some help with digital tools here, and then we can listen to the questions from the ground.
Yes, for sure. Ukrainian women are those who are supporting, who are fighting on shoulder to shoulder with men. This is also the people who saving civilians, people who providing humanitarian aid or saving people's lives as doctors and nurses and so on. But what is very important for the whole Ukrainian families, it's to basically to wake up from this nightmare, to understand that tomorrow all native people will be near us, that we will be able to stay in our country, to develop our businesses, and basically support the development of the world. Sanctions are matters. It's very important not to support the trade with Russian Federation because it's bloody money, it's bloody energy if you are buying it from Russian Federation, because all the money which comes, they transform to bullets and rockets. And right now, unfortunately, on the Black Sea, we have 6 ships and 2 submarines with ballistic rockets, which can easily reach any European city in a few seconds. And this is a danger, and we need to count this when we deal with Russian business. So from our Ukrainian business community, we are asking to support and to lobby and advocate stopping deal with Russia and with Belarus, because we understand the close connection, and a lot of rockets now are coming also from Belarus, unfortunately. And the final statement, it's again and again, finally, please close the sky under Ukraine, and of course support Ukrainian business who are nevertheless on the situation. It's on the race. It's providing a product to European Union, G7 markets also. And we have enormous results of IT industry because IT companies saved nearly 97% of their contracts. And 77% of companies reach new clients. So we believe in Ukrainian business, we believe in Ukrainian people, and I truly believe that I will live in the country of happy and free people.
Thank you so much. As I said, I will directly give Musna the chance to speak as well.
Yeah, so like for like G7 countries and also for Global North, I wanted just to put emphasis that dealing with the countries of conflict or like unstabilized countries, so we need to take risk. It's like I know it's like governments thing, member states, they don't like taking risk, but like dealing with this situation and like when people at the risk, so we need to take risk in terms of our policies, in terms of adopting a new a policy or programs or and also to achieve like a transformative change. So if we will deal and we stay with the as business as usual, so we will not reach like that transformative change and structural change. So this is why and to put connections between all the crises. We couldn't just tackle it as boxes isolated from itself, but we need to really see beyond each crisis, what's the potentials of the risk, and also to have a real partnership, meaningful partnership with the people on the ground and with the grassroots organizations, especially with women, because they are dealing with the really patriarchal societies and also bombs and at the same time health problems. So and this is usually what we hear from the international community for Syrian women, that women are the hardest to reach, but we at the Syrian Women's Political Movement, we prepared 60 profiles of women who are ready to be in politics and also to be in negotiation for Syria, for peace negotiation. And this is also to answer this question. Women are not the hardest to reach, but the seat at the table is the hardest to reach for women. Thank you.
And I think this is the pattern we're hearing more or less for everybody. Breaking the silos. I mean, this is actually what the Agenda 2030 was all about. Yes, we have 17 goals, but we need to break the silos, otherwise we won't find any sustainable solution. And I can tell that the questions our audience have is mostly about money. I will address you for that. But also a question I want to give to the ambassador. We need to mention that the majority of the global health workforce are women. They were working at the front line of the pandemic and had higher risks to get infected. Worldwide, we will face a lack of healthcare workers. We will therefore have to improve the working conditions and wages of healthcare workers. How this issue tackles. I'm just addressing you because you were already talking about the need to invest into health and care infrastructure. And I just want to bring in here the concrete demand from the W7 to invest an additional 2% on the health and care infrastructure. This is something very concrete, and we want you to commit to this. But first of all, the ambassador, a quick answer to this one, and then we talk about money again.
Yeah, this is an issue that was raised very strongly during COVID, even though women working in the healthcare workforce knew that for decades. But let's say it came to the public's attention through the COVID because we saw so many nurses and midwives and female staff working on the ground being really the battleground soldiers of the fight against the pandemic. And on the other hand, as you were saying, and I was saying, we saw only men, on TV, in the media, giving advice on how to handle this crisis. And we saw male leaders making decisions for the rest of the population. And this was not really tackled within the Generation Equality Forum because we did not have a specific action coalition on healthcare, because we decided to have transsectoral action coalition. So on thematic thematics, but not on specific sector. So in addition, France decided to launch this coalition together with the World Health Organization, WHO, and an NGO called Women in Global Health, which advocates for more women in health workforce, more gender equal health workforce, and more women also at the head of health organizations, whether it's in the public system or in the private system, also in pharmaceutical companies and so on and so on. And so we've had some success with the coalition together with the support of the WHO, and we ask of governments and international organizations also, such as the Global Fund Against Pandemics or Gavi, the organizations that fights for vaccines, to make sure that we support and promote women in decision-making roles and bodies, and to also enroll governments to make commitments on this. And on at the national level, there was a whole reform of the healthcare sector that was launched actually before the pandemic that made even more sense during the pandemic. And one of the initiatives that was taken by the French government is to increase the wages of the nurses of the whole sector. But we know it's not enough. It's not just about wages. It's also about social recognition. It's about also their place in the whole healthcare sector. And we definitely need to invest more in healthcare, not just because there are many women working in the sector, but because it affects the whole of society.
And I think this touches upon what you just said very briefly, the connection between the ministers' meeting of the health ministries and your ministers. So there are two questions, I think, that are directly linked to you. The first one you touched upon. How is the G7 planning to ensure that they are not just building back better, but actually supporting a transformative economic recovery? And linked to this, I think, is what can the G7 do to ensure that there is an increase in public spending on healthcare services around the world? So from this perspective, and could this include more provision through aid and debt relief and an ending of IMF conditions on austerity? I know that's an easy question, but we're not afraid of easy questions, so you have the floor.
Okay. Before the war on Ukraine, I worked in the Ministry for Ecological Affairs, the BMU. And at the end of the 4 years working there, I was crystal clear that the socio-economic transformation of the economy is on the way. Because that sounds a bit surprising, but I was really clear about that. Because I realized that a strong pressure came from the financial sector. They said it's stranding assets to rebuild gas pipelines and things like that. Since war, I'm a bit more shaking because I don't know whether it is still on top of the agenda. I hope it. When I look at the German government, where for instance, the attempt to build much quicker the amount of windmills we need and renewable energies, that's a good sign. On the other hand, we are in the need to exchange the sources we got from Russia now from other parts of the world. So it's a very difficult situation, but still I see also in my ministry that all the contracts we do with the partner countries in the Global South, for instance, they combine climate activities, biodiversity activities, also with socio-economic transformations. So therefore, this is on the agenda, and therefore I think that the Green Deal, but also the rebuilding programs that are actually on the way, have that in mind. So I'm optimistic in that sense, although we have possibly a moment where this rethinking of world trade is very strong, and we all don't know how the geopolitical trade systems will be after the war. The first point. Second point, I think I touched most of that, whether we increase the money in health systems. I'm sure that there is a momentum, and we are actually trying to use this momentum. It is much cheaper to invest now in being prepared and prevent, in a holistic sense, coming up pandemics, rather than spending again that much money into immediate responses that we saw in the corona crisis. And third question, which is, I have to be cautious on this ground. I think that the age of complete wie heißt denn die Formulierung? Nicht authentic. Austerity.
Yes.
I was sorry. There was
it's
just
a tough word.
Yes,
we need
austerity.
To yeah.
That the stiff austerity policy came to an end. I mean, during the crisis, we saw also in Germany that we excluded that we stopped that. Still, it is necessary to have solid budgets, but I think. Most of the governments know that as well as the transformation, also the building up of resilient systems costs a lot of money, and that you need money for that. And therefore, the concentration only on austerity, which was a main topic for the last decades, loosened and became a bit easier than it was before. So it's a diplomatic, cautious answer. If you ask me for my personal opinion, we can do it afterwards.
I will definitely get back on that. But you just mentioned again the Green Deal, and the next panel coming up is focusing directly on climate change and climate justice more specifically. So I don't want to jump into this too much, but I just want to bring your attention to our lovely logo. And there you see not just green, you see actually a lot of colors, and this is what we ask you to. When we talk about breaking the silos, we really need to add colors to those deals. We need to accomplish rainbow deals, because it's not just nature we took for granted. It's not just nature that we took for free. It's women's unpaid or very few paid work they're doing every day. And when we're transforming the whole economy, this is the very moment we really have to understand this. So it's not just green, as you see. If you just take one picture from the summit today, just this colors, I think this is very crucial. And some of you ask us, well, these are very impressive women. Where's everybody else? Where are the women from the Global South? Well, what you can't see, they're here with me. And they wrote the recommendations you listened to just in the very first video. And just stay put, because in the next panel there will be others as well. And we're trying to present to you as many of those 65 advisors who are working with us as possible. But maybe, Mosna, you just can agree. There are more women. It's not just us, but it's always very difficult to bring more than 60 people on one panel. I think that would be way too long. So I think we'd like to put an end to this very intense and long discussion. Thank you so much for agreeing to, end this complexity, or at least try to focus on some points of this very complex picture, because we started with COVID, then we understood, there's this digital transformation taking place as well, which is hitting women differently than men. And then we have a war coming up, and we have the security crisis, and we ended even with the climate change. So it's not so easy to discuss this one crisis, but we have to take into account the effects and how these are multiplying the effects on this individual. And that we need to make sure that the solutions we find need to have women and girls in the center, obviously. Every cent we are spending has power. So sticking to the fact that we have neutral solutions for a problem is just impossible, because every solution has consequences, and the worst case or the best case is actually the situation stays the same, but in times in which there is no country on the whole planet where gender equality is achieved, this is definitely not an approach we can afford. So understanding each cent has power, and then as we ended up taking the rainbow from behind of us and putting this at the heart of the solutions we need. This is, at least from my perspective, something we need to do. But I'd like to welcome on stage another W7 advisor, because we have here with us the co-chair of one of our working groups, the working group focusing on women's economic empowerment, justice and rights, Ursula Schäfer-Preuß. And what is important for you to understand, she was the first ever Director General, the female one, from the Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development. So they should be some sort of colleagues, and it's good to see what's coming up next. But you are also the Vice President of UN Women here in Germany, and you are engaged in so many others, organizations and associations. I can't manage it here, but I want to give you the chance to speak from the perspective of being one of the co-chairs of this working group from the W7, and maybe at some points we missed here, but would be happy to hear from you. So, Ursula, the floor is yours.
Okay. I hope this is working. Dear friends, dear colleagues, I'm really very happy to be here with you. We had a really complex discussion, exchange of views, starting, I think, with the Agenda 2030, looking into where we will be going with this G7 summit. And our particular theme, I have to get the right theme here, building back fairer key factors of a gender-just COVID recovery with a transformative economy. I think we went from grassroots and civil society up to the highest government level, and one can really see how important it is to have the dialogue between the civil society, the grassroots people, the people on the ground, and you really have given us very moving examples of the situation in your respective countries and how to cope with the manifold challenges. And then we have heard how the feminist foreign development and I would say peace global policy has to forge to get women more in the center and try to establish a more gender perspective, looking into financing and looking into funding. I think this is the gender lens that is so important. Women, men, and diversity to get all these dimensions together. And I found it interesting what Dirk Meyer said, looking into how to transform in a way bilateral and multilateral cooperation and financial and technical cooperation and get the gender lens better into that. I think there is a lot to be done. We have to get there's finance available, private, public funding, but it has to be focused. We have to get out of the famous silos. They have been there for many, many years, decades. So let us see also what has been said looking into the Gender Equality Forum. There are really good platforms to move things together and then also try and implement what we have been saying here in our communique, which will be handed over to the Chancellor tomorrow. And I think we really have to get implementing on the ground all the many recipes that are there. And so let's see how we can move on with that. Thanks to the panel, thanks to the audience, and I do hope that we can move on with our W7 agenda. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ursula, for wrapping us this so perfectly. So, the ambassador may have left already. Still, thank you so much. Sending some greetings to New York. Thank you so much, Daria, for being here on the panel with us. Thank you so much, Musa. Thank you so much, Dirk Meyer, and lots of energy and good luck. And we're still here after our summit. So if you need someone and need some advice, just give us a call. We're definitely here to discuss. And so handing over to Carolina again.
Thank you so much. It was such an incredible panel. So I owe you, dear audience, also a response on what we had left behind. You know, the interactive question, the survey from where you're dialing in. You remember I asked you, put in your town or city. So we solved this, and we can now have a quick view on this. So many people are here in Germany, of course, in Berlin, but we also have audience in Japan, in Osaka. We have from India, we have Chandigarh, Iraq, Iraq, from Ottawa, from Canada. So you can see a lot of different places, France and so on. So great to have you all with us today. And now we're having a short break. So before we start with our next discussion, and this time it is about the climate crisis and its gendered impact. So see you in 15 minutes. Enjoy. Glad that you're back. I hope you enjoyed your break. So now the second panel is following. The second panel is about developing gender-sensitive responses to the climate crisis that leave no one behind. So before my colleague Vera Otterstein, W7 policy advisor, is taking over, another short video is introducing you to the W7 key demands on climate justice. So again, you will meet some of our W7 advisors. I hope you enjoy and you enjoy the panel afterwards.
Hey G7, climate crisis is never gender neutral, and women and girls are the most affected by climate change effects.
We are all fighting a global climate crisis. It impacts every single one of us, especially those who are vulnerable, including marginalized women and girls.
We need for you to redirect financial flows away from fossil fuels and towards a more resilient and equitable future.
We, the W7 advisors, thus call on the G7 to invest in gender transformative climate action, promote biodiversity, and empower women towards leadership and decision-making.
Advocate that women have equal rights to own access and inherit land. Advocate that women have equal legal rights to have access in financial loan, and progressively eliminate inequalities in education, in the society, and in the healthcare system by 2030.
Meet and surpass the annual 100 billion goal directed at low and middle income countries. Ensure that funding has an intersectional approach and accessible to feminist and women's rights organizations. Redress loss and damage with a strong gender lens.
We also need for you to recognize that low and unpaid care work is systematically relevant for climate change adaptation and resilience plans.
So, the G7 leaders, are you ready? It is time to deliver.
It's time to deliver.
So G7 leaders, are you ready? It's time to deliver.
Welcome back, and a big hello from us. We are very happy you are here to join us today for the Climate Action Panel, and I'm very excited for facilitating today's discussion. My name is Vera Otterstein, and I have a great list of panelists joining me today. But first of all, you have just seen the W7 advisors presenting the W7 recommendations to G7 leaders. You have heard time is up, and it's time to deliver. And just to make this clear, just to say a few statistics on why it is so important. When disasters strike, women are affected 14 times more often, are 14 times more likely to die. 80% of the displaced people around the world, they are women and children. And we have recently seen in the IPCC report that global leaders have failed to implement gender transformative and effective responses. So time is running, and this is what we want to discuss today. So I'm very happy to introduce to you our esteemed panelists. And just to say this, today it's even more relevant because tomorrow the G7 ministers for climate and environment will meet in Berlin to discuss their responses to the crisis. So we really hope they are listening, because we have some responses ready for you, and I'm happy to introduce to you, first of all, I'm Janet calling from Kenya, and Dr. Janet Kababeri Macharia, she is head of the Gender and Social Protection Department and senior advisor on gender issues at the United Nations Environmental Programme. For the past 20 years, Janet has been promoting women's empowerment at a global, national and regional level at the UN Development Fund for Women, United Nations Development Programme and many more. So thank you, Janet, for joining today's panel. Also joining online is Harjeet Singh, and he is actually he's the co-coordinator of the Climate and Justice Working Group of Civil 7 and also expert on climate impacts, adaptation and migration. He also works as a strategic advisor to the Global Partnership for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. So, and in this role, he also led the Action Aid international global work on climate change until recently. And Harjeet, what I also found very remarkable, you are also co-founder of Satit Sampada, a social enterprise that promotes sustainable and organic agriculture in India and beyond. So we are very looking forward to also hear about your experiences from that work. So good to have you here. And now turning to my right and to my left, maybe first left, Hannah. Hannah is here because she is because now I'm looking for the introduction, because Hannah is our U7 delegate, and also you are the working group chair of the climate group of the U7, correct? And you are not only that, you are a sustainable activist from South Africa. You are studying in Cape Town. And you are also the co-chair and co-founder, actually, of a big organization in South Africa. Because I now lost this page, can you follow up on your the organization here?
The South African Youth for International Diplomacy.
Thank you. So we are very happy to have you here because you have not only joined this year's Y7 dialogue, but also last year's Y20 dialogue. And so it will be very interesting to hear your perspectives from the different processes and the youth perspective and how this intertwines with the gender perspective. And last but never the least, Martina, we are very happy to have you here. Maybe it will be a little surprising for you that Martina is on my right, because unfortunately State Secretary Jennifer Lee Morgan wasn't able to attend today. So we are very, very happy that Martina Rogato, our esteemed W7 advisor and working group chair for climate justice, is joining today's panel. And as you have just seen, together with Ruth Richardson, she is our climate action expert in W7. And she's not only that, but also sustainability advisor and founder of ESG Boutique and professor at LUMSA University of Rome. And she is co-founder and honorary president of Young Women Network in Italy and was Sherpa and spokesperson of Women 20 in Italy last year. So Martina, thank you so much for joining today.
My pleasure.
So enough of the talking. Let us now start with the first round of discussions. But before having said that, I also do my best to look at this little iPad, and we have our question list up. So please use the tool. I'm already seeing a lot of different questions, and I'm doing my best to integrate them into the discussion. So let us start with the first round. We have 3 rounds of questions for our dear panelists. So I would like to start with Janet. Janet, you in your role as head of the Gender and Safeguards Unit at UNEP, you are supporting your member states in integrating environmental policies into the development and investment planning, and you also provide tools and technologies that help the member states to implement an environmental sensitive policy. So what do you perceive as the main challenges from your work? Because you have the perspectives from the different member states and the different cultural and economic backgrounds that they come with. What do you perceive as the main challenge in integrating a gender perspective into these kind of technologies and tools?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation to come and participate in this panel. I'm very happy about being part of it. We can look at the challenges at 2 levels. At the level of UNEP's challenge, which is not just UNEP alone, because you can see that this is quite the story around other UN agencies. And this is the lack of understanding as well as a lack of capacity to understand that a little extra investment in gender equality and women's empowerment approaches would make investments in environmental sustainability more durable and equitable. And again, the advisors to W7 also pointed this out. So we do actually need a strong and firm mandate from the member states to work on gender transformative actions in environment and climate change. Of course, we do have the Paris Agreement and other agreements, but then again, there's no specific obligation to invest and plan.
Thank you, Janet. And I mean, hearing this what Janet just says, Hannah, you have this perspective from coming from this youth activism and coming from the U7 dialogue in particular. Where did you see similarities, now listening to what Janet just said, and similarities and intersections between the youth perspective and the gender perspective, for example, when talking about a meaningful participation in policy making? And also, I mean, you're also coming from South Africa, and what we see and what we just heard, that it's women and girls from the Global South that are actually the ones that are most effective in multifaceted ways. So do you believe the Global South is actually adequately engaged in the G7 process so far? Yeah.
Thank you for the questions, Vera, and thank you for inviting me. It's a real honor to represent my Y7 colleagues and my country, South Africa. So to answer your first question, I think that women and youth face very similar issues when it comes to barriers to being part of high-level negotiations. So it's often young people and women that are working on the ground, starting social movements, whether it be around climate change or social issues. But if you just have a look at our G7 leaders, our heads of state, all of them are men. Most of them are white and most of them are relatively old. And so even though we are here today at the Women's 7, and last week I attended the Youth 7, and that's really amazing, I have to ask myself, how far do our recommendations go if they're landing on the laps of old white men? And then to answer your second question, my main motivation for working in the sustainability field is the reality that Africa has contributed the least to climate change, but is going to be most impacted by its effects. And this justice issue is not taken into account enough in the G7 dialogues, and the accountability is lacking as well. So in previous years with the Y7, countries have been invited, additional countries have been invited as observers. So they merely would sit in the conversations and they were not allowed to give input or vote. But I'm happy to say that the German organizing team was much more progressive and inclusive. So there were 4 additional countries, South Africa, Senegal, Ukraine and Indonesia were invited as partner countries. And that's important because we were given equal access to contribute towards the conversation. And we were also allowed to vote on the policy recommendations at the end of the dialogue. So although the process, the progress is slow, it is definitely starting to happen.
Thank you, Hannah. So you're talking about the justice issue, that it's women and girls that are actually that contributed to least to the problems are the ones that are the most affected, but that in the role within the G7, of course, there is a big legitimacy gap, and it is an exclusive club. So what you are saying now, including partner countries and making their voices heard, is already at least a first step into going into this direction. And it would be very interesting to hear, Harjeet, you have been part of the Civil 7 process and also led the Climate Action Working Group there. So I'm wondering, first of all, what has been the role of gender equality in these discussions of your working group, but also coming from a background, I saw that you have also been part of the UN Technical Expert Group on Comprehensive Risk Management. And we have just talked about the risks and the likelihood of women and young children to die are more likely to die because of the climate crisis. So what are the challenges and why is it so difficult to include these perspectives in, for example, risk management?
Thank you very much for having me, and it's a pleasure to join you all. So as Civil 7, we had various working groups. We had 5 working groups, and efforts have been made across the board to integrate gender equality and intersectionality. And if I speak of climate, it was very clearly highlighted how climate change disproportionately affects indigenous people, women, children, small-scale farmers, fisher folks, as well as people who are on the move or in fragile contexts. And the discussions, while developing the communique, as I said, even beyond climate change aspect, the injustices have been highlighted, which are caused by multiple crises. And we know that these crises are not gender blind, as women and girls across the board are particularly affected. And we also, in the communique, we demand socially and gender just and holistic policies, as well as the rapid redirection of financial flows from fossil fuels, as we also heard earlier. But at the same time, the communique does talk about the leadership and meaningful participation of women, LGBTQIA, indigenous people, local communities, and vulnerable populations. Now, when it comes to the intersectional approach under the UN, we know that it has not been a priority because of structural reasons. And but at the same time, in the last few years, we have seen things changing as the constituency groups representing those vulnerable populations and sections of the society, they have been way more assertive than ever. And we have seen women's rights groups in particular have worked really hard in the last few years to make themselves heard in that space. And I can speak that, highlight that, for example, Paris Agreement includes language on gender equality and empowerment of women. Similarly, what we could manage to get in 2014 was a work program on gender, which then evolved into a full-fledged work program on gender in 2019 and also gender action plan. Now, this has not been easy, knowing that 200 countries, their governments and societies come from a very different context. But concretely speaking, if you look at whether it's leading to change on ground, I would say yes, there is progress. For example, there was a recent review of Green Climate Fund. It found that 95% of the approved projects have provided gender assessments, and out of which about 90% have been able to even provide gender action plans. So, the pressure that was created at the UN level is beginning to kind of convert into real financing, real support. And about 80% of projects also provide gender disaggregated indicators. So we are making progress. So the pressure at the UN system level is beginning to translate into some actions. But of course, we have a long way to go because the need is massive. The inequality that exists is huge. But yes, the efforts that we are making, and particularly the women's rights constituency, gender constituency, that has started seeing some fruits of action.
Thank you. That are very good news, and I've noted that now 95% is a great number. And just highlighting again, one of the W7 recommendations is, for example, that ODA funded programs, that all of them come with a gender lens, and at least 20% of these programs just actually spotlighting and having gender equality as their main objective. Like these two recommendations are from the W7 communique. So I think this really, hearing that the UN is already making that such big progress and pioneering this this way of working is, I think, a very good start and a big step. It would be interesting to hear now from a little different perspective, because as I just said, Martina, she is not only very an activist in, you're not only at a university, you're not only working at this big organization, NGO, but you are also a sustainability advisor, and you work with companies to help them integrate the ESG standards and help them integrate gender perspectives into their ways of working. So I would be very interesting now, kind of going from this policy making to this level. What are your experiences, and why is it so challenging to convey this message?
Thank you so much, Vera, and thanks to the W7 presidency for this invitation. It's an honor representing Italy and also the W7 Working Group on Climate Justice. And we are a very diverse team coming from different countries beyond the G7-1. And for this, thanks to the W7 presidency for this choice. Usually, from a private sector point of view, when we imagine ESG, we are very focused on the E of environment rather than to the other aspects. So usually companies do not consider sustainability ESG as a strategical integrated approach with environmental issues, but also human rights impacts and economical impacts. Or when we are focused on S of social, we are more focused on charities and philanthropic initiative rather than human rights. So it's very important, I think, to stress the accent on the importance of developing an integrated approach. That means mapping human rights impacts along the value chain of a company, also including an intersectional and gender approach. Because diversity, first of all, means women's rights and do not discriminate people because of gender, sexual orientation, identity, and so on. So it's a very human rights issue and should stay inside the S. Things are changing a lot, especially in the last 2 years, because companies are becoming year by year more aware. European Union, for example, is pushing a lot with mandatory regulations and directive on it. But we need to spread awareness, and we need also to improve, as SDGs used to say, partnership among different stakeholders to really create something very more impactful and inclusive. Thanks.
Thank you, Martina. I think it's very important to hear also this perspective, because when we talk about policy making and the ways the policies affect the way the economy is built, and of course we are always talking about not only improving the system but also rebuilding the system, I think it's very important to hear how the corporate side is trying to make little steps, and it's more important to have someone like you explaining and conveying and making the connection to the civil society movements. But for the second round, and I think this fits very well, we actually want to talk about the ingredients. When we say things like gender transformative climate action planning, I mean, that sounds very technical, but we want to, in the second round, really make it clear what does it mean to have gender transformative programming, or to have gender sensitive programming, or how to actually develop a policy making that includes different perspectives. And I'm now looking again to the logo and the colorful sparks to have rainbow policy making. Like what is, I'm not sure, Harjeet and Janet, if you have listened to the previous panel, but my colleague Juliana just said how we always talk about including different voices, perspectives in terms of different colors into policy making. So it would be interesting to hear what your experience has been there. So in Harjeet, I now go again to you, because when we talk about the different ingredients, and you, 3 weeks ago, I think it was, you have already adopted the Civil 7 communique. So we are, of course, also very interested in how your communique and the ingredients you present are gender transformative. And secondly, I mean, I just in the beginning, I've introduced that you are also co-founder of this local enterprise. And I'm really wondering, how do you feel could the G7 better integrate voices from locally led groups and shorten the gap between what is done on the high level and what is actually on the ground, where they are the people that are the most affected?
Sure, Vera. As I highlighted just a while ago, that the C7 communique very clearly recognizes the disproportionate impact of climate change and other crises on vulnerable populations and women. But at the same time, it also recognizes their active agency, their leadership role in policy making and implementation. Of course, because C7 was covering a host of issues and there was a limitation of words, or even we were counting characters, so we could not go into a lot of details. But the elements of gender transformative approach, as we call it, have been integrated. The communique does refer to how we need to understand the context. It's not about one size fit all. It's about identifying gaps and opportunities, specific gender-related vulnerabilities, even systemic and specific power imbalances, and how resources are important to bridge that gap, and how communities need to have equitable access to resources. And if I also connect that with the humanitarian group that talked about relief and recovery, response, resilience. So the whole spectrum was covered in the communique. And it's also about recognizing the role women play and the burden that they have. Of course, as I said, many of the elements have been highlighted much more in the W7 communique. C7 also talks about the basic services, how we need to provide that access, promote social protection, and also how we need to create spaces for discussion, collaboration, participation, leadership. So some of those aspects have been highlighted well, so which do connect with the gender transformative approach. So we need to look at C7 and W7 communique in conjunction to cover the range of crises that we are facing as a humanity, and how we need to have holistic as well as much more deepened approach in dealing with some of these issues and promote gender responsive and gender transformative approaches.
Thanks.
So you also asked about the enterprises. I would say the kind of challenge that we are facing, we need to make sure that the solutions come from the ground. And because just a decade ago, we were living in a less than 1 degree warmer world, and look at where we are, 1.2 degrees, and impacts are everywhere, not just in developing countries, but also in the developed world. And nobody is fully prepared to respond to those impacts. And on one hand, you need better governance systems, you need more resources, but that should be coupled with more power and more space to communities to develop their own solutions. So, our role, where I'm involved in a social enterprise where we are working very closely with the farming community, and particularly women who have such a huge role in agriculture, particularly in developing countries, we are making sure that they get more resources. Their knowledge, their existing traditional knowledge has to be respected and promoted. At the same time, it has to be coupled with scientific knowledge so that they can develop their own solutions. Because we sitting here developing solutions for them are not going to work. In the past, they didn't work. In future, they will not work at all because the context changes. Look at the kind of uncertainty that climate change brings in. So we need to be empowering communities. And I keep saying that empowerment has to be goal as well as a means of working. Because if communities are empowered, even if the context changes, even if the situations are different, they'll be able to develop their own solutions. And that's why we need to work with local communities and promote their enterprises.
Thanks, Ajit, for these powerful words. And I'm now just quoting you again, the solutions come from the ground. And when I now think about the youth movement of the past years, last year there were more than 4 million young people on the street across the world voicing their not only concern, but about that they were desperate in seeing what happens to the world, that time is running up and they feel leaders are not moving, they're not doing, they're not delivering. So, Hannah, I'm wondering, from that perspective, like what is that you feel, because Ajit has already presented his ingredients and how the role of empowerment and creating space for discussion is what is missing, and what could only be the way to include the different voices. So from the Youth 7 background and also from your background as a sustainable activist in South Africa, what would your ingredients be for gender transformative policymaking?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, I think, as I mentioned in my previous answer, yes, it is often young people and women that are working on the ground, starting these social movements. And the engagement with youth and women is definitely increasing. We're all here together today. But something that is lacking is real meaningful representation. I'm tired of old white men making decisions on behalf of my life. And I want to see more people like me in those high levels of decision making. On top of that, I think we need a bit more transparency with policy making, because we've all spent hours and hours developing our communiques, but we don't really see, a transparent system of how it gets implemented and integrated into policy at the end of the day, or how it does not and why. Maybe just to share a short story from my Y7 experience last week. We spent hours and hours working on this. Some of you will know a lot of money was poured into the Y7 as well, and a lot of people volunteered their time. And at the end of the communique, once we had voted on it, we were told to choose one policy recommendation for each track to put on the front page. And the reason for that is apparently because people might only read one page. And then my question is, are we here for tokenistic reasons, or are we actually here for meaningful engagement, in which case we need them to read more than one page? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. That's very interesting that you say that, because we are also kind of following a similar approach. We have the communique, the 2-pager, because we also have the experience. We don't have that much time with G7 leaders. Unfortunately, today we don't have a G7 representative on the panel, which is a big pity, because there is a lot to say, and we will share the discussion points today afterwards. But it's I think an experience that all of us civil society representatives share. And coming from that, Janet, I have still a couple of questions, because I still would like to hear also your kind of perspective of what Harjeet has said in the first round, how there's lots of progress in the United Nations in terms of spotlighting gender equality in different programs, and that way, like, meaningful in integrating gender perspectives in the programming, and maybe not only looking at gender equality at one point of time as it's done earlier, when gender equality is just maybe like a picture that you just quickly talk about. So I'm wondering, it would be very interesting to get some concrete examples, like what are best practices from your work at the United Nations Environmental Programme, and how do you think, so now talking to G7 leaders, what are like the lessons learned that you would ask them to integrate into their policy planning?
Thank you very much, Vera. One of the lessons that I don't want to say it's a best practice, but it's a lesson learned, is that we have to use evidence-based information. You must have that data. You must have that data that is actually verifiable and that we can rely on to argue the case for gender equality and women's empowerment. And not just looking at women as agents of change, because that will actually just fade off, but we are looking at that kind of information to ensure that we have women and men, boys and girls, all levels, be part of the decision-making structures to determine the best way to address environmental challenges. And Hannah has mentioned that really the youth have to be at the decision-making table. So we're saying we need that evidence to really come and push forward to put us on the decision-making tables. Again, we have to shift gender norms in sectors traditionally seen as men's sphere. Otherwise, we are going to lose our momentum and the opportunities to drive change. So really have to start having that mind shift in terms of looking at what is traditionally female, what is traditionally male, so that we can be able to drive some change. Again, we've seen different places, different organizations, agencies, civil society members who are coming up with innovative solutions to the crisis. From our end, from UNEP, we have a project in Asia Pacific, which is together with UN Women and is funded by the government of Sweden. And through this project, we're advancing women's leadership in the energy transition And we have supported more than 40 women-led enterprises to run renewable energy businesses and increase productivity, income, while securing towards climate resilient livelihoods. And we've seen evidence, it's an example of where climate change mitigation adaptation goes hand in hand with gender equality in the heart of action. So we're saying, let us look for those good practices and then let's escalate them and have them amplified at different levels.
Thank you, Janet. And I think I'm really interested then in the next round when I would ask you for this one thing you would put in the G7 communique, because it's exactly these kind of concrete examples and initiatives, I think, that need to enter the G7. But Martina, you have now listened to the different ingredients that have been presented by Janet Tajid and Hannah, but also the barriers and challenges we have seen in putting these ingredients into G7 policymaking. So my first question would be, what has been your experience from the past years? Because, you have already engaged with G7 leaders in the last year in Women 20, but also you have been engaged in other G7 and Women 7 processes. What is your advice? Like, what is the most effective way of convincing G7 leaders? And my second one would be, of course, from the Women 7 communique and from the discussions that you have with other Women 7 advisors. What did you find the most maybe surprising or the most important ingredient for gender transformative policymaking?
Thank you so much for this challenging question. I think the main answer is to create a solid dialogue. This was the ingredient of last Women 20 presidency in Italy, and I had the chance of following also the UK W7 last year. So maintain a constant dialogue with institutions, try to support them in creating the most impactful content, being also as a civil society representative, very diverse. We should be able every year to engage associations, academias that are very diverse, representative of different point of views and different intersector experiences. And we need to share with the G7 data, the need of intersectional and gender data, but also the few researchers that we have on impact are a very good way to invite them to listen to us. And I think also the role of companies is very important. We should engage them because diversity now seems to be an hype, a trend. Instead, we need very solid, very impactful policies with the grievance mechanism, human rights and diversity assessment, and we should I think we should include company as part of the solution for pushing the G7 or the G20 on these gender transformative actions.
Thanks, Martina. And I think that was a very, very powerful answer to the challenging question. So thank you for closing this round, because the last round we really want to know. I'm looking now at the list of questions, which is also not that many. So which I think, it's a pity that the ministry is not able to be represented here, but we are still, I think it's still very important to have this dialogue and have the discussion and share the results in the end. And of course, we will have many other points of engagement. And I'm now very interested in this last round of statement, because we all know there's a countdown to the G7 summit in 4 weeks, and that's where the G7 leaders will put together a joint declaration, a G7 communique, and that's where we want to, of course, feed in our recommendations. And we have already talked about the ingredients, and Hannah has already said how it's important to, if you engage with G7 leaders, to reduce down the points you have on actually just a page, because in the end, if we are honest, we just mostly have a minute of important people's attention. But having this in mind, we have now a minute for each of you. What is your first demand. So what should the G7 leaders should deliver on? Like, what is your first recommendation, and maybe a concrete implementation step? Because this is what we are here for, not only about policy making, but policy making in terms of implementation. And I would ask now to Janet to answer first. What is your number one topic to include in the G7 communique?
Simply put your money where your mouth is. So what the recommendation would be actual political and financial commitments towards enhancing the meaningful inclusion of women and women's empowerment, gender equality perspectives in environmental matters, not just recommendations or advice, actual commitments.
Janet, and followed by Harjeet, what is your action quest?
I will not say that Janet stole mine, because that has been a common concern. So I would say G7 leaders must meet their commitments and demonstrate leadership and go beyond words, or walk the talk. And we need to increase investments and capacities and actions to achieve gender transformative results and responses to multiple crises. And as we have also mentioned in the C7 communique, the G7 must contribute to a more equitable, just, resilient and healthy world for everyone, everywhere.
Thank you. A healthy world for everyone and everywhere. And Hannah, when you talk about your one thing you would like to see in the communique, I'm also giving you this question that just came up. And how would you then hold the G7 decision makers accountable? How can we hold them accountable to make and ensure that they fulfill what we quest? But you can start with the first quest first.
Okay. There's a lot of big questions in answering in a short amount of time, but I will try. So my one thing is maybe more of a specific request, and it's to do with public transportation. And this might seem really strange for those Berliners here that are used to catching the train late at night. But unfortunately, in South Africa and many other global South countries, getting public transport for women, youth, and other groups of people can be very dangerous. So, to give you some perspective, in South Africa, every 3 minutes a woman is raped, and often this is escalated by using public transport. So I think this is we need good public transport to develop, to have more sustainable cities, but also to give women the freedom of movement and more access to economic opportunities. On your second question, that's a difficult one. I think that all of us have to work together to make sure that G7 leaders are held accountable. How we can do that, I would say through advocacy work, through conversations like this, but also through grassroots movements. I think this is more of my area of working. Thank you.
No, but that's exactly the kind of answer I think that the audience needs to hear. So and I think also the question of how to hold G7 leaders' accountability is also a really good question for Martina. But first of all, what would be your one recommendation to include in G7 communique?
This is a personal recommendation. The green transition will create lots of jobs, too many jobs, gladly, in the next few days. But we can't have a green energetic transition with human rights violation or lefting women behind. So green transition should be just. And let's not underestimate the fact that if there are too many stereotypes on green jobs and STEMs, and green jobs and women, we lost also this opportunity because over the years with STEM, science, mathematical jobs, there was the stereotype that women weren't good enough on it, so we should go beyond the bias that women are not good in STEM. Firstly. Secondly, we should go beyond the bias that for working in the green transition, you need STEM competencies and skill. Also, human rights skill are very important. So my recommendation is to really stay focused on a just green transition.
Thank you, Martina. And to close the discussion, so thank you so much for the input. I would actually ask you now, Martina, because you have been also asked to have the role of the wrap-up and present our Women 7 recommendations again to the audience. And yeah, I would ask you to go up front, and the stage is yours.
Your Excellencies, dear guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to close and wrapping up the climate panel after this outstanding intervention, and thanks to the W7 presidency. As W7 advisors and the Climate Justice Working Group, we call G7 leaders and also all G7 ministers of environment and climate change that will meet from tomorrow in Berlin to, first of all, mainstreaming gender equality in all climate change challenges and commitments, because as mentioned before, showing a few challenging data, climate change is never gender neutral. And also climate emergency is one of the biggest crises we are globally facing and is exacerbating lots of differences between economies, between different generations, and obviously among genders, with a particular impact on women and girls in all of their diversity. We ask to the Group of 7 to, first of all, safeguarding the legitimate right of all women and girls to be at the heart of climate justice, playing a role of leaders in driving climate change solution for all of us. We ask leaders to ensure an integrated approach, let's say, on ESG standards that also include human rights and a gender and intersectional approach. And concerning climate change mitigation and adaptation, we ask to guarantee evidence-based actions and a social and gender justice framework. We call all leaders to invest in gender-responsive climate action and biodiversity conservation measures that are ecosystem-based but also community-driven. As mentioned before, stakeholder engagement, listening to local community, including women and girls, is fundamental. And we ask leaders to meet and surpass the annual $100 billion goal and increase grants-based climate finance directed at low and middle-income countries, with at least 50% of gender-responsible adaptation. And last but not least, we ask to leaders to ensure that funding are based on an intersectional approach with a special focus on accessibility also for women's rights organizations. Climate change is a huge challenge for all humankind, but it could be also a unique opportunity for all women and girls to lead sustainable solution, also redesign a new post-pandemic recovery driven by equality. It's time to deliver.
It's time to deliver, Martina. Thank you so much, Janet. And thank you so much, Harjeet, for joining us virtually. I know it's much more difficult to follow and to engage and react if you're joining digitally. But thank you so much for being there. And thank you, Hannah. We are so happy that you are still here after the U7 Summit last week. And thank you, Martina. And thank you to the audience. And we are now looking to G7 leaders. We are looking to tomorrow's G7 ministers meeting, and it's time to deliver. You have heard the ingredients. So time is up. We are awaiting a meaningful response. Thank you.
So thank you for this amazing discussion. It was great listening. And now we have another interactive element, dear audience, just the last one for today. Describe with one word what you take with you from today's event. So I will come back to this in a minute or two. So you have some time to think about it, and there's no hurry. So describe with one word what you take with you from today's event. And now it's time for the closing interview recap. And for this, I very much welcome Shan Sherwan Hussein here on the stage with me. She's one of the 64 advisors to this year's W7 Dialogue, who developed the demands and recommendations we will hand over to G7 President tomorrow. So, Shan, I'm very happy to have you here. And she's one of the advisors that has traveled the longest, really. She came from Iraq just the day before yesterday. She's a gender specialist, and her work focus lies on gender-based violence prevention and related topics at a large humanitarian organizations in Iraq. So, welcome here again.
Thank you so much.
Hello. Shan, what were your impressions of the event today? Was there a highlight you want to mention, or please?
Yeah, I don't want to be that person who says the whole event was wonderful and everything was a highlight, but it was truly empowering, and it was wonderful to be at the presence of all of these wonderful and amazing women and men who are supporters and allies as well of women and our cause. What I loved about it is we talked about a lot of different crises, conflicts, war, climate change, COVID and recovery of COVID. And it was easy to see that these conflicts that we're talking about and crises that we're talking about don't have boundary, unlike the states, unlike the countries that we're talking about, that we think this is a specific issue for a specific nation. We saw that there is no boundary, there is no limit. It travels across the globe. And women are affected disproportionately. And what we did throughout working on the communique and our recommendations, we all kept this in mind, and we were a diverse group of women all over the world working on these recommendations, all of us having different experiences and bringing it to the table, making sure that we are reflecting them. So it was easy to see all the wonderful work, the empowerment, the passion that the women had for their causes to come through this summit. And I'm just truly humbled and honored to be surrounded by this much energy and passion towards women's cause.
Thank you, Shan. So great to hear all of this. And I know also that it was a great bunch of work the last months to develop this communique and to summarize the demands and to come to a common ground together, right? Because as you said, it was also important for the W7 presidency, in fact, to have a lot of people from the Global South also being part of this whole dialogue. So this is really important. But if you think of the communique and the demands, maybe also of your working group or so, and also maybe regarding what we've heard today or so, maybe if you can mix this, which demands or which key demands would you like to emphasize here?
Yeah, just before emphasizing on the demand, I would like to say the communique we developed, I agree with you, and we became part of this wonderful group since January. But what we brought to the table was our pain, our sorrows, when we decided to speak up, when we weren't allowed to speak up, when we decided to have a chair on the table, have a say in different meetings. We brought all of that back experience that we have had throughout our lives and the barriers that we have broken and poured it into this communique. So it was a product of so much experience, rich experience, that we were able to bring it together. What I noticed throughout the day we were talking about, and it's the funding. It's clear that funding is one of the issues. When funding was cut for COVID, during COVID time, women and girls got affected. When we're talking about funding not being allocated to feminist organizations, this affects our work on the ground. So it's really important that we go back to the importance of funding, dedicating and allocating funding, especially the additional 2% for a COVID recovery, as well as 50% of the 100 billion to women-led organizations and going towards the cause of women. What's really important to know, it was wonderful to hear about Germany's feminist development policy, but it's really important. We know that this is going to happen, hopefully, but then to make sure that those organizations, those grassroots who are going to receive this funding are going through gender audit, to make sure that women really have a say. Women are decision makers in those organizations as well.
Thank you for this. We also made sure, or I think also in our discussions with the whole advisors and in the working groups, to make sure that these are smart demands. You mentioned several numbers, so this is very, I think, kind of easy to grasp, and to see and to work on this. So this also goes to the G7 leaders. Please read it. Take it with you. And now wrapping up, what are your expectations of the summit tomorrow? We have this handing over to the G7 President and Chancellor Olaf Scholz. So what are your expectations towards this?
Well, from today's event, the bar is set really high. So I believe that tomorrow is going to be another wonderful day full of concrete, smart goals directed at the G7 presidents. And as you said, I do truly expect that they will read it and implement it. What I want to say is we are here from both the Global South and the Global North. Please talk to us. Please let us know if you need advice. We are here. We have gone through it. I've grown up in poverty, in war, and I do understand what it means when you don't receive support and when you receive support, and how to empower women. So if there's questions, don't make the decisions on your own tables. Come to us, ask us. We would be more than happy to share our experiences and the lesson learned with you.
Thank you so much. A grand round of applause for Can. Thank you so much. Dear audience, I will come forward maybe here. This concludes the first day of the W7 Summit 2022, but not without a brief look ahead of tomorrow. So tomorrow, as you know, will be the big day of the handing over of the W7 demands to the G7 President and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, and look forward together with us that Olaf Scholz will be here present with us for his keynote and the exchange and the handing over. So we'll very much look forward to this. And we will as well have a third panel tomorrow, and this will be on feminist foreign policy with State Minister Anna Lührmann and renowned international activist. Furthermore, we will hear from Professor Allmendinger. She's this year's chairwoman of the GIEC, of the Gender Equality Advisory Council. And as well, we will hear voices from W20 Indonesia, our sister process dialogue, and an outlook to W7 2023 hosted by Japan. So we are excited, and we hope you join us also at the second day of the W7 Summit 2022. So more information on the agenda can be found on women7.org and on our social media channels, of course, at Women7Official. And before I close, of course, I want to tell you the results of the interactive survey. So the question was, remember, describe with one word what you take with you from today's event. So we can see the results, I think. Have a look at the impressions of today. I see a big, big word in the middle, and that's empowerment, and that's so great. Empowerment, but I also read leadership, follow the money, what you just said also, Sean, access to platforms of power, inspiration, feminism, inspiring together, motivation, delivery, female energy, and all of this. I wish you and us, and I thank you all. Goodbye, and hope to see you tomorrow.